In this, the final online presentation, I want to give you some of the theory and information behind how we administer group crisis interventions. So in the interactive group crisis intervention techniques, we deal with two of them. One is called the diffusing, and the other is called the critical incident stress debriefing. Let's start with the crisis intervention diffusing. Information on these topics can be found in your book on pages 86 to 92. So some of the foundation behind which the crisis intervention techniques were developed comes from Yalom's 11 most therapeutic factors for effective groups. And they are impart information, instill hope, altruism, universal concepts, corrective recapitulation, socializing, initiation of behaviors, specifically behaviors that can activate individuals' coping mechanisms and move them towards recovery. We want to do interpersonal learning. We want to foster group cohesiveness. We want to provide an opportunity for catharsis. And then we want to provide guidance, nurturing, assistance, and support for individuals as they move through the stages of critical incident stress. So we want to make sure that we are delivering group interactive crisis interventions, that we have homogeneous groups, and that individuals that would not be part of or fit into a group or have had the same exposure are not included in an intervention of everyone who has maybe had the same exposure or was on the crew or the team that dealt with a particular disaster. Homogeneous groups are well served by interactive group processes. The two interactive group processes we're going to learn about are diffusing and the debriefing. So we want to help people understand and resolve the traumatic experience, and this can best be accomplished using brief group discussions, because group members do tend to learn from each other because there are varieties, again, of personality types, experience levels, etc., even within a group that we would define as being homogeneous. We, as the practitioners, can better understand why we do what we do and why the models for the interventions are constructed the way they are when we understand that there are basically three types of groups. Our primary groups, or those are very homogeneous. Might be people on the same crew, same team. If it's firemen from the same house that responded to an emergency, etc. Secondary groups are those that have some familiarity with the situation or the exposure, but they don't fit really tightly in with the very homogeneous groups. Maybe people in the same department, maybe athletic training students who were not present when a serious injury or fatality took place, so they have some familiarity with the people in the process, but they weren't right in the homogeneous group that dealt with the emergency. And then we have what we call random groups, and these groups are extremely heterogeneous, and we really have trouble finding common threads that would tie the people in that group together. The diffusing and the critical incident stress debriefing are designed only to be used with homogeneous groups, and they should never be used with heterogeneous groups because of the lack of similarity in experience, training, exposure, etc. So a diffusing is an interactive group process. It's usually done the same day after an incident ends. So when maybe the crew returns to the station, after the patient is transported in an athletic training situation, maybe after the game is over and everybody's come in and they're cleaning up. But it's usually done within about 8 hours after the incident ends. The diffusing itself has little effect after about 12 hours after the incident is over. The group has to be homogeneous, and if the opportunity to conduct a diffusing would be missed, then we move to one-on-one support and then later get a group together, the homogeneous group, for a debriefing. So if you can't have the structured group immediate intervention called a diffusing on that day, then we move to other methods. The diffusing lets people let their guards down a little bit because they're around people that are like them. In other words, policemen talk to policemen. Athletic trainers are more comfortable talking with and processing things with other athletic training. Firemen, same kind of situation. So their emotional guards are down, they're stressed, they're a homogeneous group, and they need something now. They're more open to the right kind of help when you have a homogeneous group and they're in crisis. They're open to the right kind of help. Right? We want to focus on unit cohesion and unit performance. You know, a lot of this theory was developed around dealing with the military or dealing with police and fire and EMS, but there are some strong parallels about the group cohesion and performance of the unit when we look at athletic training staffs or athletic training staffs that are using the assistance of athletic training students while they're learning. So we focus on cohesion, unit performance, leaning on each other. Now, sometimes that's all they need. It's basically like getting people together, processing, and the group may be able to recover and move on to their adaptation just fine. In other cases where maybe it's a prolonged time till you can get the group together or the event had more significant impact, then a debriefing should be considered. And if they're very intense reactions or they're suppressing and burying their reactions and whatever, or there appears to be unfinished business when you're done, or there's an additional need, then the debriefing is indicated within a few days after this time. So you're part of a CISM team and you've been called in and you provide a diffusing for a group after an emergency or a disaster or a crisis. What if we should be considering that a CISD would be appropriate after we did the diffusing? Well, we're not seeing appropriate emotions for the situation in the respondents, and there's a number of reasons that that could happen. Maybe we're seeing excessive emotion. Maybe some stuff that's inappropriate is coming to the surface, whether it be tensions within the group, could be any number of things, but emotions, reactions that are maybe not tied to this situation or that seem to be inappropriate might require additional time together. If when the diffusing's done, it still feels like we have unfinished business, then a debriefing may be appropriate. And if we see individuals withdrawing and we can't communicate well during the diffusing, maybe they're just not ready yet. So the diffusing is run. We get to the end. We consider scheduling a debriefing later. And after people have had a little time to process, they may be in a place where they're better able to communicate. So, some more things to know about the effectiveness of diffusing. If a debriefing is necessary, it's generally made stronger by having had the diffusing first. It introduces individuals to the nature of the process, the kind of discussions that are had, and it helps to build both your credibility and trust because you tell them it's a confidential process and they get to see that that's in fact true. In a line of duty death situation, we have a special 5-phase debriefing, and that is done instead of a diffusing. That's a little more intense situation. It requires a little bit different way of running the intervention, and so a 5-phase debriefing is done when you have a line of duty death. This particular technique is taught in an advanced group crisis intervention course, but we want you to be aware that in the situation where you might have a line of duty death, you're probably going to want to access members of your team who are trained in advanced group crisis intervention and who also probably have some higher levels of experience in conducting group interventions. When you're in a disaster, because again, the process is still going on, a RITS would be used to deliver information and provide people with feedback about what's going on and maybe food, etc. It's provided instead of a diffusing because in a disaster, the situation is ongoing and we may not get to the end of the disaster, even though the end of someone's shift has taken place and they're coming off the line. So what constitutes a homogeneous group? Okay, the group members have to have a relationship with each other before the traumatic event. So, for example, a police department, a fire department, firehouse, an ambulance crew, an athletic training staff. These individuals have a relation with each other before the event. They have a shared history. They spend considerable time together before the event. Athletic training students spend a lot of time together. Athletic trainers spend a lot of time together with other members of their staff and other members of the athletic department. They have gone through the same traumatic event. In other words, the people who are in the homogeneous group are people that are being exposed to the event that we're dealing with today. This warning slide reinforces for us the concept that if the group is heterogeneous, then we shouldn't be using the diffusing and debriefing with those individuals. Heterogeneous groups get the RITS for staff in a large event or the CMB. So what are we doing in a diffusion on this first day? In the diffusing, we want to stabilize the group. Make sure everybody's okay. Make sure people's emotions are consistent with the event that's taken place and not unexpected, out of line, or potentially dangerous. We want to provide an opportunity to help restore some unit cohesion after the event is over. By doing so, we can also help to restore unit performance. Remember, we are not there to do a critique of the operation or of their performance, but we can provide an environment where we can encourage that they perform and function as a team, as a unit. And then we also want to assess the group to determine if they need something more. The possibility that the group is good after the diffusing and they don't need an additional intervention is very possible. But we want to assess the group so that we are comfortable in that we have done what we're supposed to do and that these individuals have received what they need. Okay, so here's some cautions when you're doing a diffusing. First of all, keep it under 30 minutes. Second, don't go into more detail than's needed. This is not the time for in-depth discussions or in-depth things. You want cursory summary of the reactions and the responses, what people might have perceived their roles to be, and we want to give them tools to help to access their coping mechanisms. Don't try to turn it into a therapy session. First of all, you're not a licensed therapist probably, and second of all, it's too soon. And last, again, it's a little too soon to try to go into deep discussions of the people's emotions. Things are still very raw at this point in time, and it may be too early. So what are we going to do? What are the do's? We're going to have a brief group discussion, and that's going to include a brief overview of the situation. What happened? What was the nature of the situation? How did it affect you? What was your role? Then we're going to have a quick opportunity to get an assessment of your needs. How are you doing? What do you need? Now, I may be hungry. Maybe I need sleep. Maybe I need to just spend some time by myself. Find out what people feel their needs are and assess the group to determine what you think their needs are. Maybe they need, to be released from the diffusing. When you're done, you give them some tools. You give them a set of information that they can take away from it, and then they may need to be fed. Read the situation. You never run one of these group things by yourself. We'll talk about that a little more. And the diffusing is rarely a standalone intervention. It often needs some kind of follow-up. Many people might just need an individual peer one-on-one talk, or you may have to do a debriefing. Depends on the situation. Everyone on the team providing the intervention, in this case, those providing the diffusion, must be trained. You don't want people in the room who don't know the model attempting to run the diffusion. That's not going to go well. All right. There's a lot of things that can come to surface during an intervention, during a diffusing, without having awareness and training on the techniques and the models. People may flounder or may get lost in the intervention model or may not know how to deliver the appropriate steps of the diffusion. So you want people trained. And sometimes in a diffusing, as well as in a debriefing, you're there to kind of guide the discussion. You're kind of asking the questions, but this is a peer intervention tool. So allowing people to speak and to kind of put their emotions or their feelings or their thoughts on the table is completely appropriate. And you use that information to direct the education and the information that you provide for the individuals receiving the diffusing at the end of the diffusing. Okay, so a diffusing has 3 phases. It's a 3-part intervention. So first, there's an introduction, then we do an exploration, and then we give people information. So in the beginning, you introduce the team members. Why are we here? Here are the guidelines. We're here to help, work through and help you to maybe lower some of your anxiety or process some of your anxiety after the process of the disaster that just took place. Remember that this is confidential. No notes will be taken. But also remember that in the event that you would threaten to harm yourself or someone else, I am a mandated reporter, and that we would have to deal with by reporting it to the appropriate individuals. But other than that, we're not going to go to your boss and tell them what was said in the meeting. Second, we get a brief discussion of the experience, a short story of what took place. You don't need to know more details than what you need to know to understand how these people are reacting. So we want a brief discussion of what happened and how are you experiencing it and what are you feeling and how did it affect you. And then the last thing we do here is we provide information. We inform people that what they are experiencing or feeling is normal for people that go through this situation. We summarize the key points of moving forward. We give them guidance and potentially give them handouts and information. And that's how the diffusing runs. So this slide goes through some of the things you might cover in an introduction phase, and it's covered in your book. So we're going to introduce people. Why are we here? What are we going to do? And what are we not going to do? Okay? You kind of motivate people to participate. We're here to kind of help you process this. Some people don't understand the process, but we're good. Set the ground rules. Tell them, we prefer one person talk at a time. Participation is voluntary, but we would, encourage that you do so. Everything's confidential. What's said here stays here, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? We're not investigating anything. This is not an operational critique. So we're not here to talk about somebody didn't use the right tool or somebody applied the bandage or the wrap or the splint the wrong way. We're not here for that. We're here to focus on your reactions, responses, emotional state at this point in time. We don't force people to speak, right? And everyone's viewpoints are important. So one of the things you kind of want to make sure you do is that if somebody kind of in the group starts to move into maybe being a little judgmental or maybe trying to maybe say that a point is not as important, you want to kind of shut that down. So after everybody's introduced and you've gone through the opening formalities, get a brief description of the event. Brief description. If you need to ask clarifying questions to make sure you understand something you need to know, that's when you do that. Let them share their experience only as much as they wish. We're not here to pry. We're not here to like go deep into, their life history. How's your thing? How are you reacting to this? How are you responding to this? What was the worst part of this for you? And short answers. Try to identify any themes or concerns that might be across the group or throughout the group that may be something you want to address when you give them educational information. See how they're doing. Do they appear to need more help? Do individuals in the group appear that they kind of need just a one-to-one with somebody? Even maybe at the end, maybe one or two people in the group kind of look like they're not handling things well. They might benefit from a one-on-one peer intervention. Okay, reassure people that things will return to a somewhat normal state, that the situation will resolve, and that what you're going through is normal, and as you go through the process, it too will resolve. And the final phase of the diffusing is the information phase. During the information phase, we want to acknowledge what people have told us and provide a brief summary to make sure that we got it right and we understand. We want to tell them that the experiences that they're having are normal for individuals who have gone through these kinds of experiences. We want to teach some of the key stress survival skills and help them identify some coping mechanisms that they can use. We want to emphasize self-care, exercise, talking to people, getting appropriate rest, etc. We want to encourage that individuals get plenty of rest, that they participate in their family life activities and their hobbies, and that they do what they can as best possible to manage the amount of stress to which they're exposed at this point in time. Additional information on how to conduct the information phase of the diffusing is available in page 82. At this point, we're going to move on to the final intervention that we're going to cover in this course. The final group intervention that we're going to cover in this class is the critical incident stress debriefing. I just want to remind everyone that the debriefing is a specific group intervention model. It is not synonymous with the comprehensive term critical incident stress management. In addition to this slide presentation, information can also be found between pages 93 and 136 in the book. What exactly is a CISD? It's a structured group discussion concerning a critical incident, and the discussion focuses on how the individuals have responded to being exposed to that traumatic event. It was first described in the 80s by Mitchell for use with emergency services personnel. It has historical roots in military psychiatry, and it's very important to understand that it requires a team approach. A debriefing should never be conducted by one CISM interventionist alone. What are we trying to do as a CISM team when we're conducting a debriefing? We want to mitigate the distress. We want to facilitate psychological normalization and closure or reconstruction of an individual's normalcy. We want to set expectations for psychological and behavioral reactions. This way, individuals know what may or may not take place. We want to serve as a forum for stress management education. We want to give people information about the skills that they can use to help get through a difficult time. We want to identify external coping resources, whether it be access to a CISM team, whether it be mental health professional providers, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, etc. And we want it to serve as a platform for psychological triage and referral. One of the important things that the CISM team does during a group intervention is observe the individuals in a group to help identify those who may benefit from additional care. So we want to help identify the resources you need to have available when conducting a critical incident stress debriefing. You need a minimum of 2 CISM trained team members. You need at least 1 mental health clinician. The other team member can be peer support personnel, spiritual leaders, another mental health or physical health professional, but one of the individuals should be a mental health professional. But remember, all team members must be trained in the interactive group process, CISD, and you need to be trained in the same process so that you're all working on the same page. If you are the individual responsible for planning the CISD, here are the things you need to consider. The size of the group should target between 2 and 20 people. When it gets bigger than that, individuals may be much more reticent to participate, or there may just not be enough time for everyone in the group to participate. You tend to plan 1 to 3 hours for this to take place because individuals are going to speak and it's a longer process than a diffusing. Usually you want to hold the debriefing 1 to 10 days after the incident. Now again, it depends on a couple of things, but in most public safety situations, it's done within 3 days, but for a large-scale disaster, it may take 3 to 4 weeks before people and the situation are ready for these kinds of interventions. The timing has more to do with the psychological readiness of the individuals in the group and of the care providers than it has to do with the passage of time on the calendar. And the location needs to be a room with chairs in a circle or around a table that is away from the incident site, but not terribly away from the incident site. And it needs to be free of distractions. After you identify those items, you have to find a convenient time for everyone that would be attending the CISD and for your team. You want to make sure that all of the personnel who were involved in the incident are invited to attend. When attending the debriefing, the individuals should be relieved of their duties. In other words, there should be somebody else covering for them. So it's not appropriate to do a CISD for, say, a firehouse or a rescue emergency services crew when they are on duty. Again, ideal size 2 to 20. The group needs to be homogeneous, okay? And they need to be homogenized with regard to traumatic exposure and psychological toxicity. And this takes some time to make sure that you plan with the supervisors or the individuals of the group for whom you are going to provide this debriefing. And you should plan to target 1 team member for every 5 or 6 participants. But it should never be less than 2, and the reasons for that we'll explain a little later. And you need to plan after it's over for the potential of people needing additional resources, for the potential of follow-up, and for communications with the individuals for whom the debriefing was provided. While conducting the CISD, keep the following things in mind. What goes on in the room is strictly confidential. In other words, you're not going to report what so-and-so said to their boss or to some outside entity. There are a couple of exceptions to this. One is if somebody indicates that they're going to harm themselves or potentially harm someone else, that needs to be reported. And also an individual who may be threatening to commit a significant crime. It's probably a good idea to report that also. We don't take any breaks. If we're going for an hour, we go for an hour. If we're going for 2 hours, we go for 2 hours, because the bonding, the emotional processes that take place, you don't want to just stop so we can get a cup of coffee in the middle of that. The timing is important so that when you are planning this and when you are getting a location, you want to make sure that all of this is considered, as we talked about before. You want a good location and a physical environment that is relatively comfortable. In other words, you don't want to maybe be doing this in a corner of a warehouse someplace. And you want to use the closed circle format. And the reason for that is so that everybody in the room can see everybody else and that somebody doesn't feel like they're excluded from the conversation because they're sitting in the back row. When conducting the CISD, there are some common ground rules. Number one, make sure everybody that's there is part of the group that should be there. Strangers, individuals people don't know, maybe someone who was not on the crew or team that provided care at that incident, those individuals need to be asked to leave. The other thing you want to be aware of is it's not a bad idea sometimes to ask the group, hey, is there anybody here we don't know or we're not familiar with? Because there have been times when press or media have attempted to sit in on a debriefing, and that is completely inappropriate. People may participate and they may choose not to. They may choose to listen. That's their choice. It's not, forced speaking. There are no notes. There are no recordings. What is said here stays here. You do everything you can to limit a break until we're done. Now, if somebody has to go to the bathroom or something, that's another, issue. But if you leave the room, one of us is just going to follow you to make sure you're okay. And, if you go in the hall and you say, no, I'm just going to the bathroom, we're not going to follow you to the bathroom. But make sure you remember that when someone leaves the room, you need to have enough team members there so someone can step out and just check in case that individual needs one-on-one discussion. This is not an operational critique. We're not here to investigate what you did, how you did it, what went right, what went wrong. We're here to talk about your response emotionally and psychologically to the traumatic event. We don't blame here. If people start to get accusatory or something like that, you want to kind of shut that down and redirect people back to, we're here to focus on your response right now. Operational things will be taking place by the appropriate people at a different time. It's not therapy. Right. First of all, it's probably a little bit early to get into therapeutic interventions, but also we're not trained and licensed mental health providers. And if you're not a trained or licensed mental health provider, you should let individuals who need that kind of support be treated by appropriate people. And again, don't forget to address the issues of confidentiality versus the privilege of, speaking or whatever. We're here to help each other and to protect each other. The critical incident stress debriefing is made up of 7 distinct phases, and each of these phases has a specific purpose. So we're going to go through those, but let's get a feeling for the way that the CISD progresses. There's an introduction. Then is there a fact phase? After that, we talk about thoughts that individuals are having. Then we have a reaction phase, and in the reaction phase, we really get into the emotional responses, how this thing is affecting someone psychologically, and what kinds of symptoms or what kinds of feelings and thoughts they may be having. It's followed by a symptom phase where the team begins to discuss and present what are the symptoms, what are the normal things that occur to people who are having these kinds of reactions and who are exposed to these types of events. The teaching phase then gives the participants in the group information about self-help and stress management techniques and models and things to do, and also about the potential resources that they may want to access, including mental health professionals or maybe a follow-up with the CISM team. And last, we have a reentry phase where we prepare the individuals after completion of the debriefing to kind of attempt to get back into their normal daily activities and normal work habits, etc. During a critical incident stress debriefing, the team takes the individuals through a series of events, or what we call a progression, to help the individuals process what they've been through. We start in the cognitive area with information and facts. We then progress into the affective area where we talk about reactions and feelings and response to the critical incident, because remember, we're focused on the response. That's what we're there for. And then we help the individuals to express and to process those so that we can then work them back towards the cognitive area and help them with what's called cognitive reframing. So it's kind of like taking them into and out of the psychological trough, and we do it in a structured way. And in order for that to happen, we go through what's called a transitional domain. And in that process, we start in the introduction with facts and information. And in the beginning, it's not directly related to the incident. It's about who are we, why are we here. We'll have individuals say their name, introduce themselves, tell us what their role was, etc. What are the ground rules for what we're doing? Basically getting cognitive information in place. And then we start to look at the fact phase. And the fact phase is where the individuals talk about the incident. What happened? What was your role in the incident? What was your job? Now, we're not there to critique anything, but it allows the individuals in the group to express what they did and what their role was, which helps the CISM team members understand how the individuals participated in the traumatic event or the critical incident or the disaster, so they can help to direct the individual in accessing appropriate tools to respond to this. We then go through the thought phase. What thoughts did you have immediately or shortly after the incident? And then we get into the deep part of the trough. And this is the area where we start to have individuals talk about their reactions, psychological reactions, physical reactions, emotional responses, anger, etc. After a period of time of discussing these and helping the people to understand that what they're going through is normal in light of a traumatic incident like they've gone through, we then can work towards helping identify symptoms and explaining to people what are the symptoms, what are the things that people exposed to traumatic events go through, so that they have an understanding. As we transition from emotional right brain affective thinking back towards giving the people some tools, we talk about symptoms. And to do that, we start to go back into facts and information. We then can teach what are appropriate stress management tools, what are the things you can do, are you accessing your coping mechanisms, and what are they, and how could you do that, along with what resources are available to you on top of what you're seeing with a critical incident stress management team. What if you would be helped by mental health treatment? What if you would be helped by counseling? What if you would be helped by interaction with a leader in your faith, a priest, a rabbi, an imam, a minister, etc.? When we get done and we want to wrap this up, we kind of prepare people for re-entry back into the life and into the room, into the world, and get them ready to hopefully start processing and accessing the tools that we're teaching them, or to potentially seek referral should that be necessary. So what happens during each of these phases as we progress through the debriefing? Well, the introduction phase is what it is. Hello, my name is Dave Middlemass. I'm here as part of the Critical Incident Stress Management Team, and I will be leading this debriefing today and explain why you're here and explain where the bathrooms are, explain that there's not going to be any breaks taken until we're done, explain what's going to happen, get people to know why we're here, why we're going to do what we do, what we don't do. In other words, we're not here for counseling, we're not here to identify people, we're not here for an operational review. Then we're going to ask the individuals in the group to give a brief review of the situation. In other words, this is the fact phase. What happened? What was the situation? What was your role? What were your first impressions of the incident? What did you think about it? How did it affect you immediately or at the time? Then we get down to where we start talking about responses, and we start talking about emotional state, and we talk about the physical and potentially behavioral and mental reactions. And a lot of times people go one of two ways. Many people can process and participate in the discussion and discuss what is affecting them or what bothered me most, but other people will potentially cry or break down or become very shaken by the discussion, and there's a wide range of reactions that can happen depending on the individual. But this is the time when people are likely to have distress. We talk about then what are the signs and signals of distress, both that you can look for in yourself and you can look for in your colleagues and in your friends and in those around you. In other words, this is part of helping to reinforce the team cohesiveness concept of critical incident stress interventions. We then give information about stress management, recovery process, maybe how to identify and access your coping skills and mechanisms, etc. And then we sum things up. This is what we did. This is what we talked about. Here are the resources, how to get in touch with us, etc. And this can take anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, depending on the size of the group and how much information they wish to discuss about their feelings and their emotions and their responses to the situation. And it can be different based on the type of intervention that you're doing. In other words, the type of incident that you are working with, whether it's small scale, large scale, experienced people, etc. So you want to plan time and you want to be flexible in that. Don't plan a hard hour, because at the end of the hard hour, if people are still down at this phase in the distress phase, or you're just coming out and discussing signals of distress, you still have parts of the debriefing that you may want to complete. So there needs to be some flexibility in your time scheduling so that if you need to stay a little longer, you can do that. Okay, I want to briefly review the information so that as you practice this in the in-person section, you know what you're going to be doing or what you're going to attempt to be doing when you are role-playing. And the practice sessions are obviously role-playing because, as a rule, we don't necessarily want to trigger off a number of negative responses or stressful incidents that may have happened to people in the class. But here's the outline of what you're going to do in each section. So in the introduction, who are the team members? Why are you there? What are we to expect out of what's going to happen today? What might you expect and what might not happen? What are the ground rules? Anticipate problems ahead of time and try to address them. So, for example, if you're working with a volunteer fire department, you may want to ahead of time anticipate a potential for a call coming in and see if you can schedule another, or not you schedule, but maybe the chief or someone schedule that another fire company or another town's department will cover you during the period of time that the debriefing is taking place. Plan ahead. And the things that need to be planned for in the ground rules are going to be different based on the group with whom you're working. Address the confidentiality issue and note that the exception has to be there for harm. In other words, if you say things that indicate that you're thinking about committing suicide, we're going to have to talk with someone about that. Participation is voluntary, and you can preview some of the questions that you might be asking as you move into the next phase. After you've completed everything on your checklist for the introduction phase, which, by the way, isn't going to be a very long period of time, maybe 15 minutes, then you want to move on to the fact phase. And you can ask a simple question like, would you please let us know who you are and what happened from your perspective? And if it's a team or a fire department, police department, EMS, athletic training staff, whatever, can you tell us what your role was? Now, you can use this same prompt when the group has been exposed to multiple stressors. Even in disaster out processing. So even with something as significant as the Twin Towers collapse on 9/11, or when Captain Sullenberger landed the plane into the Hudson River, or any other number of situations, after a team or group is done at the end of their tour of duty, you may want to just ask, can you tell us about your experiences? What happened? Now, there are some things that can cause issues. One of them being a larger than expected group shows up at your debriefing. And there may have been a lot of people involved, and the group is still homogeneous, but just more people showed up than you expected. Maybe it's a large disaster team. Maybe it was a search and rescue team, and there was a negative result or a really upsetting situation, and a lot of people showed up. So you want to change a little bit about the way that you deal with this. Also, when an administrator places the members under an arbitrary time restriction, in other words, a leader, a boss, an officer, whomever has said, oh, we have an hour and a half for this, and that's what we're going to do, then you need to kind of manage your time a little bit. So questions like who arrived first, what happened, then who came in next, what happened then, can be used to kind of just expedite and organize the collection of facts, knowing that in this phase with a large group, you may not be able to get everybody to speak, or with the time restriction, there's just not time to get everybody to speak at this particular point. So after we gain an understanding of what happened and who was involved in the progression of events, then we can ask, what was your prominent thought that entered your mind about this? And the responses to this can go from personal to work-related things to something you didn't expect. Maybe the thought and the exposure triggered something else from someone's past. You don't know what's going to come up, but you want to be prepared to listen and use the active listening techniques so that you can be empathetic, and also so that you can get a picture of what's going on in people's minds. And this is when it starts to get real. What was the worst part of the event for you? In other words, what were your emotional and psychological reactions and responses to this event? What gives you the most distress? What bothers you? If you could erase one single aspect, what would you want to eliminate from this whole experience? How is this affecting you? Now, we're not in a big hurry to rush and get through anything. People may need some time to talk about their reactions, but when you feel that it's appropriate to move on, you can then start to talk about physical and behavioral changes people experience. What has life been like? Are you doing the normal things you do? Have you seen any signs of distress in yourself or others? And there may be some overlap back and forth between the reactions and some of the physical and emotional signs and symptoms, because they're interlinked with each other. But at this point, we're starting to identify information for people so they can understand the symptoms they're seeing, so that we can then take them into an understanding of how to access the tools they need to potentially help themselves. When the team determines that it's time to move forward and all the emotional baggage is on the table, now you can move into the teaching phase, because people are ready to start receiving information after they've kind of emptied their emotional bucket. So at this point in time, team members can talk about normalizing your reactions, understanding that what you're feeling through is common in people who've been exposed to these kinds of disastrous situations. You can give them some anticipatory guidance. You can teach them stress management techniques. You can use external resources or describe what they are and how to access them. Also, during this phase, things like handouts and info sheets are very helpful, because it gives somebody something in their hand to take away when they leave. You have to adapt what you're teaching to what has been expressed. So you have to listen, because even though you may have a standardized list or script in your head, if the team talks about a particular reaction or a particular set of emotional upsets and it emphasizes only one part of your list, you have to give people what they need, or what they are telling you they need at that point in time. You want to encourage participants to recover and to access others and to access the people around them and their network and to continue to work to get through the process. The group should be used as a resource. In other words, they can help each other. They can look at each other. They're supposed to have been a cohesive group and a team who spent time together before they got to this place. So this is where you want to talk about how they can do that. And the reentry phase is where you kind of wrap it all up and pull it together. So again, you reinforce the concept that what you're going through is normal for people who've gone through traumatic events and critical incidents. You want to take questions and answer them as best you can if it's appropriate. Summarize the key points of what you've gone through and what's been taught and the lessons for the day. Give them a task or give them something to do when they leave to help them cognitively reframe their life. Maybe, build back in taking your dog for a walk. Structure some time to play with your children. And the last thing is foster group cohesion. And this is a real good time at the end of the session to maybe have a little coffee or some soda or water or refreshments or whatever, which allows them to, again, come together without the impact of a traumatic event or a call or something like that going on in order to be together. Now we're going to take some time to practice these techniques when we get together in person. And that's when hopefully the nature of how this works all comes together for you. Thank you again for taking this course. Thank you again for taking the time to read the book and to go through the presentations. During these series of presentations, I wanted to present the information and the background so that when we come together, we can spend time actually practicing and understanding what's going on as we go through these particular models.